Robbie Crouse, welcome to Magnalia podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
You are a theology professor at Knox Theological Seminary.
Yep.
You're also a Presbyterian minister, same denomination as me, the PCA. Start us out with just talking to us about what theology is.
Well, theology basically takes Scripture, takes church history, and is dealing with taking the scriptural narrative and then putting it together into what does this tell us about God in total and comprehensive. A lot of times answering a lot of the questions that people have asked in church history as it's brought up. So the debates that have gone on, bringing in philosophy, bringing in just the questions people ask about it. But I think that one of the best definitions is what you're doing is the biblical narrative. Biblical theology is sort of tracking it as a narrative. So like what is Genesis to Revelation? But then theology is kind of zooming out and saying, okay, once we've seen the whole narrative, what does that mean about these different topics? So the topics of traditional systematic theology, God, man, creation, is just answering on the basis of the whole of what the Bible says. How can we formulate these things? Logically put out things that are sometimes seem contradictory in Scripture when we see what looks like God repenting over here. Other Scriptures saying God does not repent like a man. Systematic theology is trying to say, okay, how do we put those things together? Where a biblical scholar might be able to zoom in on their verse that they're dealing with, systematic theology is kind of zooming out, answering those questions, trying to put together logical conundrums, that kind of thing.
Is theology just restating issues and answers that people have already come up with?
Hopefully not. There is a place for just continuing to answer questions that in new ways, not just for the novelty of it, but that we can answer things better, I think. But I'm definitely of the mindset that history takes an important part of systematic theology, and we need to listen to the wisdom of the past. Confessional, you and I are part of a denomination that takes confession seriously, so that we're standing on the shoulders of others who have gone before us, considering what they've said, trying to sometimes nuance it, sharpen it. But there is ways I do think that we can continue to think about things differently than those of the past, even just areas that sometimes when you look in church history and you think, oh, Christology, theology proper, they've talked a lot about, but other topics sometimes less so. So you can dive more deeply into those in our own age.
So in kind of our world of kind of Protestant evangelicalism, especially in America, there's a long history and impulse towards innovation, towards kind of reinventing yourself, kind of putting your finger up to the wind to see what the world around you is interested in and what they want to talk about. Protestants are not typically known for their interest in the past, for their respect for tradition, for their love of church history. I've seen in my own ministry a tendency in my own life, but also a lot of people around me, where you kind of read the Bible, you get to the end of the book of Acts, and then you say, well, here we are today. And maybe on a good day you say, and then you get to Martin Luther and the Reformation, and then here's us today. As Protestants, why and how should we care about tradition and the history of the church, especially in a wider culture of constantly innovating and feeling like you have to be innovating all the time?
Well, a number of very wise theologians have connected sort of historical reverence, tradition to the Fifth Commandment. I think it's great. The Fifth Commandment is honor your father and mother. When you're a kid, that means strict obedience, no questions asked, you obey mom and dad. But there's a sense of when you grow up, the relation to your parents changes, but it's still honor. And so that's the sense of we honor those who have come before us. Sometimes honoring means disagreeing. When you're a grown adult, you can disagree with mom and dad when they give you advice about parenting, but you should do so at a little bit of peril in the sense of you need to be sure because you should really respect what your parents have to say about things. So I think that's a great model for thinking about church history, theology, is you honor the past. You realize that you're downstream of everything they've done. You can give examples in evangelicalism about that when you say, who is Jesus? And someone says, he's God and man, one person, two natures. Well, where'd you get that? Well, you got that from centuries of the church answering that way. That didn't come just pop out of the page of Scripture. You've gotten those formulas, categories from others. So, yeah, I think in theology, it's the sense of honoring it. When you think about particular doctrines, you have a pause when you're kind of doing the innovation thing of like, maybe it's this. Like, doesn't mean you can't. Like, I think there's legitimate ways to say our past has got it wrong in certain things, but you should do so with like a lot of reservation.
Right.
In my own like just kind of theological thinking, where I know that I'm in a minority, I try to hold that view with a lot more like caution, humility than the ones that's like, yeah, I'm just right with the center of kind of how Christians have thought about this.
Right. Around here, we talk a lot about Bitcoin,
Yep.
which is a relatively new technology. In the world of Bitcoin, in the world of wrestling with kind of relatively recent monetary struggles and problems, there's a tendency to go to the Bible if you respect the Bible and want to listen to it kind of with your conclusions already drawn, and you're looking for verses to support what you already think,
Sure.
with little regard for what's come before. Why should even those who feel very passionately about new and recent things and feel very passionately, it could be Bitcoin, it could be other things, passionately about issues of justice and injustice, why should they slow down and listen to what has been said before us, even if it doesn't quite fit with what we want to hear?
Yeah, I think when I teach my students, I think one of the things I try to do with church history and theology is to think about analogies. Just as this theologian in the 4th century dealt with this issue, we don't have the exact same issue. So it's like Bitcoin, we can't find like anybody else talking about Bitcoin, but can we talk about analogies that another theologian would have in his own day? So that takes wisdom. It's not, like you said, there can be this tendency, particularly among evangelicals, to have just like one-to-one correlation. I want the Bible to speak directly, like without any kind of needing to translate this in the sense of make analogies, what's different, what's similar. But I think you make analogies about that. And, why do we do that? I think, again, it's the sense of humility. It's the sense of listening to others, gaining wisdom through the Proverbs are all about this. Listen to your father and mother, and that's where you gain wisdom, and then you apply it in new ways. But you're still to listen to the past. Just listen to those who have gone before you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and kind of one of the other common themes in evangelicalism and Protestantism more generally is a kind of inward focus on my personal piety and devotion, and kind of a severing off of the rest of life from God and from the life of the church. We were just talking the other day about how many sermons, the way they apply Bible passages is usually
straight to the
individual devotional,
internal,
kind of personal life and suffering, and ignoring much bigger realities of where the world is headed, what God's doing in the world, what the church is, what's happening in the church. Why and how should we listen to those bigger picture questions beyond just my personal issue? And how, Reformed theology in particular has tried to apply kind of these great truths of Scripture and of the Reformation much more broadly to the world and how we should function in the world.
One answer to this is when you pick up your Bible, it's hard to do, this isn't sort of an objective thing, but just think about how much of the Bible has to do with politics, kings, nations. It certainly does speak to the individual spiritual life and how we're to do that. But, much of it is kind of this wider – the Bible is very interested in like wide history, human race issues that are in total. So it's not just kind of speaking to each individual on their own. So I think we need to be concerned with those kinds of things as well. We need to connect the two. We need to connect and sort of – it's always the case that we can – run to one of the other extremes. So even as evangelicals want to deal with the wider social issues, connecting it to personal piety is important. But particularly for conservative evangelicals, where we're kind of in, opening that up to like the social issues are important. Like clearly the Bible speaks to those things. I mean, you could do just a kind of doctrine of creation, which is that God made this whole world. He made it vast. He made it complex. So he cares about it. So we should care about it too.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. We've been talking about how Christians can disregard what God has been doing in the past. Evangelicals in particular can also get pretty wacky on what God's going to be doing in the future. You're interested in eschatology, this branch of theology that has to do with where God is taking the world, how the world as we know it will end, and how it will be renewed. Why is eschatology, just more generally, before we get into kind of nuts and bolts, why is eschatology important?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you just said actually is a great way to start, and it's how I kind of start with my students, which is generally when everybody hears eschatology, even just the terms, what eschatology means, study of last things, that usually has the sense of the very last things before Christ comes back, before the end. But I think it also, in theology, has the sense of the end when we use the term end, not just the finality, but the goal. Yeah, exactly. So why did God make this world? Like, where does it going? In that sense of, I think that's a wider part of eschatology that's really important. What's God doing in the world? What's the purpose? What's the end goal for all of this? I mean, it can even relate to what you just said about like Christians, particularly evangelicals, focusing on individual piety. Well, I'm going to heaven when I die.
Right.
Well, that's true. I mean, it's part of eschatology, but this larger sense of God's plan for the human race, for creation, for the cosmos, those are questions that eschatology wants to answer that I think are really important that we grapple with.
Right. Yeah, so typically when I tell people that I'm trying to help Christians and churches understand Bitcoin in light of Christian theology, they're very baffled because it seems like things like Bitcoin, I think partially because it has to do with money, and to many Christians, money feels like kind of a dirty subject that's just kind of unspiritual. But they just don't see the connection between things like that and the Christian life. I once gave a talk trying to explain where and how Bitcoin might fit into the Westminster Standards, our confessional documents that were written 400 years ago. And somebody came up to me afterwards and said, I don't know why you're talking about this. Christians shouldn't be concerned about this. And he kept saying, Christians just need to be thinking about heaven. Yeah. They just need to be focused on heaven. I've sometimes been concerned that there's an overreaction to kind of heavenly mindedness in evangelicalism, to where you say, no, you really should be focused on renewing this world. That's what God's really concerned about.
Everything's about social issues.
And as I read the church fathers and the reformers, there's a huge emphasis on going to be with God and to see God and to enjoy Him. But where is that attitude of you just should be thinking about heaven and focused on going to heaven? Where is that wrong-headed or misdirected? Where is it right? Where is it a good impulse?
I mean, I think the best of our theologians of the past made this is what makes theology is distinctions, and distinctions like that which is ultimate, that which is penultimate, and something that's penultimate, meaning secondary, doesn't mean therefore like unnecessary, like just it's not even worth thinking about. It just means that it's just under the other. Like this thing is most important, and this thing is second important. But there's an article, I love the title of the article, The Importance of the Penultimate. It's like, the penultimate doesn't mean not important. It just means slightly less important than. Right. So, I think you're right. I think evangelicals need to continue to have a sense of communion with God is the ultimate. But that doesn't mean that God himself doesn't say, well, part of my communion with me is that I want to renew creation. I want to rid the world of the curse and its lingering effects, and so that's part of Christian life as well. So having those kinds of it's the old adage, like you can walk and chew gum, like you can do both. Like you don't have to choose only heavenly minded, only earthly minded. Right. You can say heavenly minded is like in your own personal piety and sense of like your longing should be number one, but then out of that there should be a real sense of wanting to do God's good work in the world. And so that should lead us to think of social issues like that as important, the penultimate, but they're important.
Right. So, I've sometimes feared that kind of the contemporary focus on this world, issues of justice in this world, and the kind of well-intentioned evangelical impulse to change the world. And sometimes it shows up in things like this big emphasis on work and on vocation and on career, and that your career matters and your daily work matters. I've sometimes wondered and feared that that is a luxury of living in a prosperous Western society. That's almost like most people in history haven't had.
Yeah, they couldn't choose their career.
Yeah, and like I heard somebody say one time, I can't remember who it was, but he was saying, for most of history, Christians have not gone to church to find out how to fix their life now. They've gone to church to make sense of their misery.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's true. I think, I do think a lot of I think you as well, think a lot of the recent emphasis on work and vacation has good effects. There's good things about it. But like you said, there is a kind of not paying attention to history of saying this isn't a normal thing of which career should I choose that most advances the kingdom. That's not a question that most people have asked. But I think asking, there is a right way of just thinking about a theology of work that simply says, how can I connect what I do 6 days of the week to what I do on the seventh? And so that's good. But it should apply not only to the, kind of the classic tropes maybe of today, the lawyer who's doing justice for, child trafficking, to the person who just is a janitor. It should apply to any kind of Christian vocation that you really have work in the world. It's not, I think a lot of the discussion about vocation and work tends to be a fairly elite sort of
a white-collar professional.
Yeah, you have the power to change culture. Well, that's great. that we should speak to those who have that, but we should also speak to those who didn't have a choice to their career, and they're just doing it primarily to make ends meet. So, yeah.
I was once talking to a pastor in Silicon Valley, and he was kind of bemoaning. He said, most of my job as a pastor is counseling younger professionals who don't think their workplace has good enough perks and benefits, and they're always kind of looking for a better job and constantly switching employers. And he was a son of immigrants, and his parents had run a laundromat. And he said, if you would have asked my parents in the 50s if they liked their job, they would have had no idea what you were talking about.
Yeah.
They would say, I'm just trying to provide for my family.
Yeah.
I don't think about whether or not I enjoy my job or not.
Right.
Getting back to eschatology, evangelicalism in America has been heavily influenced by dispensationalism. It's with that tended to become fairly pessimistic about eschatology and about where the world is headed and about the church and its prospects for the future. What would you say to those who are very pessimistic about the world and where it's headed?
Yeah, I think you start with the basic facts of our Christian, sort of basic beliefs of our Christian creedal. Jesus is Lord. His lordship is over all. His resurrection and ascension means that Christ is reigning now. So there is a tendency, particularly in dispensationalism. I had somebody once I spoke to who was adamant that Jesus isn't reigning now. How could he be? Because there's all this bad stuff happening in the world. And so taking that, it's that's really sad that a Christian can't even say Christ is Lord. His point was that Christ hasn't fully consummated his kingship, which I think most Christians would want to agree with that, right? Christ reigning right now isn't the way that it will end. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 when he makes all his enemies his footstool and hands it over to the Father. But I think for those who are pessimistic, you begin with things like God's created sovereignty, his sovereignty as creator, and Christ's lordship. But I think I would also point to the Bible has a lot of very glorious promises that seem to pertain to this world. And this is we can discuss this in a second, but again, that tendency to over-spiritualize. And so I'm thinking particularly of Old Testament prophecies, the Isaiah 2, Micah 2, same passage. It's about, the city of Zion will be lifted up and the nations will stream to it. They'll beat their swords into plowshares. And that kind of thing is what I think that there are legitimate Christian ways to speak about when the gospel goes forth as God's kingdom expands, moves, the church increases, that there'll be this worldly effects that are good. We don't have to sort of shy away from them. Again, I think with the penultimate, on the other side, just to maybe anticipate a question on the other side, I think dispensationalism has a right fear of something like the social gospel, where everything is about just kind of this natural humanistic progress. That's pretty much our culture today, is don't want to be on the wrong side of history. Like, history's moving forward. We're all going to be better toward the utopia that comes. But there is a Christian way of saying, God does bring enemies under the footstool of Christ. And we can see that in history. Like, the church began as a beleaguered little group in the Roman Empire and has had incredible effects on the world. And there's nothing wrong to point that out and make it an apologetic of the world's different because Christ is king, because he's reigning right now as Lord. So, yeah.
Where do you think the pessimism in eschatology has some good things to say to us and reminders to us today?
I think particularly in the area of suffering. So those more optimistic models of Christian eschatology that want to say, like, Christ, is the flag's moving forward. We're gaining ground. Christ is conquering his enemies. I think the more pessimistic can remind those other eschatologies that there's still suffering and there is still setbacks. And just because Jesus is Lord doesn't mean that I myself will not experience suffering. So I think that's a primary area. It's not a straight linear line. I think I try to connect sort of God's cosmic work in the kingdom to individual sanctification, in part because evangelicals probably do have a better handle about individual sanctification. A Christian who accepts Christ and walks their life isn't every day is better than the next. Like, I'm every day, like, I'm sinning less. No,
right.
Like, there are seasons in which, our own confession says we fall into grave sin and experience the displeasure of God and suffer our own consequences from sin. But overall, there is a sense, I think, particularly, again, in our confession, it's a statement that says the regenerate part doth overcome. There is growth and grace for the saints. But it doesn't have to be this kind of, like, cartoonish, every day is better than next, and it's just sort of this straightward upward line. I think that's what we think of with, that's what I'd like Christians to think about with history, is Christ's kingdom really does go forth, and it will progressively shatter all kingdoms into nothing. The kingdoms of this world will become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ. But that's not a sort of day by day, everything gets better.
Right.
It means that kingdoms rise and fall. So that means if you're part of the kingdom, you're part of a nation that falls in some sense. That doesn't mean that God's work isn't being done in greater ways elsewhere, and that this too will pass. This time of suffering.
Right.
So I think those are things in which a more pessimistic eschatology can give appropriate accountability to those who are emphasizing the more optimistic, I guess it were. Yeah.
Right. If you are living, let's say we grant your argument that the gospel has meaningful effects on society, and you look over the last 2,000 years and you see pretty vast changes in the world, especially under the influence of Christianity. I've sometimes wondered because I wrestle with, sometimes I feel guilty that I live in a time and a place and was born into a society that's quite prosperous and affluent. And I just, with the internet now, it's so easy for me to find wonderful resources about scripture and theology. I'm almost embarrassed by how much I have, both spiritually and materially. Should Christians feel guilty if they come later on to enjoy all these wonderful things? Sometimes there's this inverse prosperity gospel where it's like the more you suffer, the more close you are to God, the more poor you are, the more God cares about you. And, in the last 50 years, there's been a real kind of reaction against there are lots of problems with the American church, and there's lots of things to criticize in it, and there's a lot of laziness and apathy, but it almost kind of really strongly emphasizes, we should all be out there suffering and going by on very little, and we should all be radical missionaries. Is that appropriate? Should we feel guilty? Where and how do you, as a pastor and a theologian, help people to think through the kind of issues of being embarrassed by how much God has done in our world?
Yeah, I have a friend who calls it the poverty gospel. Like, we don't want a health and wealth gospel, but we don't really want a poverty gospel either. And so I think the start is just looking at a big picture, biblical picture of what wealth, possessions fit into it. And it's not just sort of poor is better, suffering is better. Suffering is not a good in and of itself, but God uses it. I mean, God can, Hebrews 12 talks about, seeing all discipline from the Lord as training. It's training for righteousness, as an opportunity for you to grow. But God also, the thing is, I think particularly for Reformed Christians and wanting to confront a bad health and wealth gospel, it's like we just then say, well, that was the Old Testament, and the New Testament, God likes suffering. I just think that's not a good way, even within our Reformed tradition that has, I think, done a good job of showing the continuity of the Old and New Testament of Scripture. No, God does emphasize things in certain times, and there is a progressive revelation in the sense of showing us the coming of the Messiah. But yeah, there's all kinds of passages that God grants wealth as part of a way that He blesses people. And so we should see that as an opportunity to share with others, as receiving it from God's hand with thanksgiving. So I think all of those things, a sense of stewardship that is part of, again, the resources that we have, not to feel guilty that we have it, but to be able to then receive it with thankfulness to give to others. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I know what you mean, that there is kind of this sense of, and I've seen it in some evangelical preaching that almost tries to berate congregations that we're not like the rest of the world that's suffering for it. And it's like, that's just not a healthy way to motivate Christians for Christian living, is just to have kind of a guilt complex for it. It's again, it's stewardship. It's to whom much is given, much is required. So, but that's not a bad thing. Like, it just means that we need to have really good sense of our stewardship of these resources.
Right. Yeah, I think often about that passage in 1 Timothy 6 where Paul's reminding Timothy about how to pastor rich people, rich Christians, and he says, you need to remind them they need to be generous, and that God has given us everything to enjoy. Yeah. He seems to assume that rich Christians can and should and will be very generous with what they have, but that they will also still be rich Christians, even on the back end of their generosity. Yeah. But kind of getting back to your ultimate, penultimate, Paul also says, you need to teach them about real wealth that really and truly lasts. Yeah. That, yes, God has given you this penultimate earthly wealth to enjoy and to give away, but it's not ultimate wealth, and it doesn't ultimately last. Yeah. Thinking about kind of the relationship between the things of this world and how they relate to the things of the next world, how do you think human culture and technology relate to the renewed world to come? Yeah. Do they bleed over into it? Do we kind of reset all of a sudden? Is everything just radically different? Talk to us about that. Yeah, and I've talked about this before, that there is kind of a recent push to emphasize the continuity, probably because of things like a dispensational eschatology or an eschatology of kind of radical discontinuity, like nothing of this world matters because the next world. Well, then there gets to be an emphasis on the other side of like anything you make, anything you do is just gonna show up again in the new world. So it's like there's, I think, a right emphasis. If I had to fall off on one or the other side, I'd probably fall off more on the continuity side, because it does relate sort of God's work in this world to his ultimate goal. And so you should, do your best in your labors and that kind of thing. But I think the Bible is actually fairly opaque about what exactly that looks like. And so we don't need to say like every painting you do is going to just show up in the next world. I don't think there's enough evidence to make those kinds of statements. But I think there's enough evidence to say God as creator and God as redeemer are not two separate sort of categories. And so his redemption is related to this creation. There is a glory of God renewing this creation, not a different creation, but this one. Right. And so Christians should work in such a way that we know that our labor isn't in vain. So 1 Corinthians 15, just after talking about the resurrection. So I think those things are, I wouldn't always make sometimes, again, the very specific applications of it.
But I think you say something like, if God made it in this world, he certainly cares about it. Will he care about it in the next? There's a good chance. And so if he cares about it now, at the very least, like, you should care about it too.
Right.
I think as that relates to technology, kind of like what we were just saying, I think of technology, money too. I mean, you're the better theologian of money, but as just tools, like, tools are not morally neutral in and of themselves. We can say that there are some tools designed for evil purposes that it would be very difficult to say there's a redemptive purpose to it. But at the same time, in general, tools, while speaking about their essence as not morally neutral, they do have the sense of they can be used toward different ends. You can use a hammer to build your house or to kill somebody. And so tools have then that sense of toward what end. And so there is that, again, that sense of like how one stewards it. And I think that does relate to eschatology and again, the sense of goal. As we look at the biblical story, begins in a garden, ends in a garden city. You know, a lot of people have made a lot of this, so it might be not news to people listening to this, but God does care about culture, and it seems like the arc of the biblical story is about like redeeming. God wants us to use the things of this earth as resources to give glory to him, to build a godly culture, to offer it to him. The sense of offering, I think, is very interesting to me in the Old Testament, that you offer your labors to God.
Right.
And that does seem to be, you kind of have to read this back a little bit into the Genesis 1 and 2. I think there's that great statement, and I think it's in Genesis 2, that as the description of the garden, and there's gold down in Havilah.
Right.
Well, why mention, why care that there's, well, it does seem to be the sense of like, well, Adam should go get it.
Right.
Go get that gold.
There are beautiful, wonderful things out there to be discovered and cultivated.
And particularly to be offered to God.
Right.
There's good, particularly I think in our tradition, our Reformed tradition, good thinking on that kind of creational eschatology.
Right.
Gerhard Voss famously said that eschatology precedes soteriology. Like there's a goal even before there's a need to be redeemed from the fall.
Right.
So God has a goal for Adam. This is our own tradition of a covenant, pre-fall covenant, creation covenant, covenant of works, covenant of life, that God has a goal for Adam to do. And so for humanity, my own position on how that relates to after the fall is that there's still a sense that trajectory is still there, like that humans are to offer up their cultural labors to God. Again, not with any kind of one-to-one, we know exactly what will happen when we offer it up to God, but that he will accept it and use what we've done. You can think of, Paul in 1 Corinthians 3, where he talks about, the labor that he's doing, and, there's labor that gets burned up that didn't matter, but there's also labor that seems to
passes through.
Yeah, passes through, exactly.
Would you connect, this passage has sometimes been taken in weird places, but would you connect this to towards the end of the book of the Revelation, the kings bringing their treasures into New Jerusalem?
Yeah. As you know, I take a number of New Testament passages to be speaking about a near kind of fiery trial, but I think the larger picture of human labor and of like that which humans do, done into the glory of God, will be accepted by him. In part, because of Christ's sacrifice. It's not any kind of merit, like, oh, this is so meritorious of a human, like it's free from sin. Everything we do is tainted in some sense by sin. But through Christ's sacrifice, you can even see this with the Old Testament offerings that, you make your sin offering, but then on top of the sin offering, you have other offerings.
A fellowship offering.
Yeah, there aren't just related to sin. Right. Like that you're offering up the first fruits and so things like that. Well, what does that have to do with sin? Well, it doesn't. It just has to do with like humans owe God returns on that which he's given to us.
I'm grateful for what God has given me. And I'm responding to that.
Yeah.
Changing tacks slightly, you are a big fan of C.S. Lewis, and you have taught classes on C.S. Lewis and kind of how to approach
as an amateur, but yes.
As an amateur. But students really like hearing about these things. C.S. Lewis spoke to all kinds of issues as, outside of his own narrow professional training. He had an amazing capacity to speak
he would
more
say
broadly.
As an amateur. But
as an amateur. One of the themes across a couple of different books is this tendency for humans to use science and technology as a way to oppose God.
Yeah.
And its link with the demonic. Talk to us about that, about what he has to say to us today and what he foresaw.
Yeah, Lewis has a great, just a kind of incisive insight into modernity or postmodernity, whatever you mean, our recent age of cloaking our religious instincts with other things. So, in his kind of writing, he would say, modern man sees itself as having thrown off religion and is a man of science. But his point is that all the instincts that, for most of human history, that are given over to religion are just then shifted into science. So science becomes, in the sense of not just, doing the scientific method, but of an object of hope, of
scientism.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so, he has these great points of, Mere Christianity talks about life force philosophy, that he says is perhaps humans' greatest invention, because it takes away all of the trappings of religion, but then houses sort of all the religious instincts. And so he says, on the one hand, when you want to sound like a rational person, you appeal to this science, sort of science will conquer all. But he does point out that human beings have we have emotions, we have sort of love of beauty that always doesn't fit in sort of like the test tube experiment. And he says that when non-religious people in the modern age want to do that, then it becomes not just science in the sense of its hard data experimentation, but almost this consciousness. Like science becomes, and you can see this in all kinds of things in our culture. Science says, like capital S.
Right.
Was science a thinking, like is
trust the science?
Yeah. Science becomes this like consciousness of all humanity. That, so I think it's brilliant. I think it gets, like many things in Lewis. I don't think Lewis is the greatest exegete certainly or theologian, but he's a keen observer of just human nature.
Right.
And so we can cloak, we can hide in language, different language, to make ourselves feel superior. So people make themselves feel superior by saying we're not like primitive man that that looked at the lightning and thought of deities. We think of the technological possibilities, but his point is you've just transferred the deity to oneself, and so you are the God who can master all of creation.
What does he have to say about the dark side of viewing the world as something to be managed and controlled and studied?
Yeah, abolition of man would probably be one of the, and then if you want to see kind of the abolition of man then fictionalized or made into a story is That Hideous Strength, the third book of the Ransom trilogy, Space trilogy. But Lewis basically says, in trying to conquer everything else, you yourselves actually become conquered because of our connection to creation and to everything else that exists. If nature is to be conquered, he says, ultimately then human nature is to be conquered. So it's almost a riff off of Jesus' statement that, what is the profit of man to gain the whole world yet lose his own soul? That's kind of what Lewis is saying, is that by conquering everything, by becoming the master of all things, you yourself then have lost nature itself. The final nature of that is to be conquered is human nature itself.
Right.
So yeah, I think Lewis is often like very attuned to. Sometimes it sometimes seems to over-idealize the ancient world, but he has a sense of the ancient world in general saw themselves as under something. And so you don't create truth or create sort of meaning. You discover your place in the world.
Right.
The world existed before me. I need to find my place in the world. But he says the whole flip of this in modernity, or what we might call postmodernity, is that I'm not under something and need to find my place, is the world needs to be conformed to me.
Right.
You can relate this very much to transgenderism, whatever it is that everything else has to be conformed to my perception of things.
Right.
Yeah.
He frequently makes these criticisms of kind of the scientific kind of mode of trying to control the world. But he also has these very insightful and sometimes very cynical criticisms of modern politics.
Yes.
What is the link for C.S. Lewis, and where does he write about this kind of dark scientific scientism and what he's worried about in kind of the modern nation state? Where does he criticize it?
It's a mode of cloaking. When we talk, he uses the term scientific democracy a lot. Like, it becomes just an experiment, a procedure. That's kind of, in many ways, I think even Christians can think of American democracy that way, where it's not about moral things; it's about the right procedures. And so and so Lewis basically says, what you've done there then is, the ancient world that would see both good and bad in rule and authority. It changes. We don't have rulers. People don't talk about rulers today. We have politicians, and it does have this sense of like those who run the science experiment on society.
Right.
Where Lewis is like, just be honest about it. Like, people rule other people.
Right.
And I think Lewis would say that's not inherently bad either. I mean, Lewis has some great stuff to say about kind of egalitarianism and hierarchy, where he says there is a truthful egalitarianism in the spiritual realm that he says absolutely should be the sort of individual soul before God. But then Lewis also says, I'm a hierarchicalist, because you just can't look at human nature and say that there are ways in which human beings just rule over others. And so we have to give ourselves to those who lead us in certain ways. And so a lot of what Lewis says then is about just sort of honesty about human life and
Stop
nature.
kidding yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so what happens is, when you do kid yourself and you think you can run the experiment on society, he basically says, you're dealing with demons. This is kind of the great reveal of the third book of the Ransom trilogy, is like these experimental scientists aren't just sort of running sort of the hard experiments of this and that. They're actually consorting with demons. Right. And so I think Lewis, wants honesty about just sort of there is a hierarchical nature to human life, not in its like base sense of the soul's sort of coram deo, but of that God forms structures of authority. Like that's just how it is.
Right. Yeah. I the last time through reading the Narnia books with my kids, I was kind of struck by it. It seemed every one of those books seemed to have some kind of little dig at kind of the modern impulse for the politician to control everything. Yeah. But also alongside of that, there's always this kind of exaltation of the goodness of wise kingship. Yeah. So like the first book, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it ends with the four, the two brothers and the two sisters ruling over Narnia as kings and queens, and talks, in really kind of beautiful, kind of funny language about, what a good rule they had, and that they didn't go around bossing everybody around and, forcing the kids to all run off to school at 7:00 in the morning. And, he wants to hold up the goodness and the beauty of good political rule.
Of hierarchy.
Yeah. But you also have, like towards one of the, I think it's Silverchair, maybe, Eustace, he goes to this very progressive modern school where they're taught, oh, no, we're modern people now, we're scientific. Yeah. And so he's kind of making all these digs at it all the time. Yeah. What does he have to say against the modern kind of nanny state impulse of that, oh, yes, the rulers are there to take care of you? Yeah. Because there is a way you could say that, there is a sense in which the king should take care of his people, almost like a father for his children. Even the Westminster Confession says Christians should long to have rulers that are like nursing fathers, citing Isaiah. But how does C.S. Lewis show us where that goes sideways in the modern state?
Yeah, I think even just back to what you said about Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, like I think that is a really great ending where Lewis is not shy that he's fine with kings. He's fine with sort of hierarchy, but it's a hierarchy that's oriented toward a common good. And so the four Pevensey children are not sort of like they renounce their kingship and we're all one common man. No, it's like they're kings and queens. But one of the glories of their kings is they like let people mind their own business. There's a lot of that in Lewis. Like I think it's a section in Mere Christianity where he talks about what are the like images of a good government and what a good government would produce like result of it. And he has the part where he's like a couple people like sitting around the fire, like talking and like kind of these like very just mundane, but he's like, the government just sort of lets people be like they're not in all their business and sort of, which is funny. I mean, so that again, people can read into Lewis all kinds of their own political, ideologies or whatever, but there seems to be a kind of good balance of like, again, kind of honesty about like hierarchy is part of human life. And so we're gonna have rulers. But good rulers are those that allow all kinds of things just sort of allow for freedom. And so, other things about sort of a nanny state. It'd be very related to the science thing of like experimenting. Like this good rule recognizes what human nature is and deals with it. So that means punishing the bad and exalting the good. What bad rule does is we can socially engineer. I mean, you think about a lot of what our culture does with language, sort of like if we can use the right words, like we can sort of socially engineer people to think differently. And
it's like Orwell's famous essay about the politics of the English language.
Yeah, I mean, and even just one of Lewis's points is like recognizing that human nature is a permanent thing. You can't mold human like nature into your own desire of it. And I think that's again a lot of what modern politics is. Like we really can overcome traditional distinctions. We really can, for example, like, every human being has recognized that there are borders and nations, and we can lament the fact that there's hostility between nations. But I think what our modern life does is like we can get rid of it. Right. We can get rid of all borders. We can socially engineer sort of this common humanity by mass immigration or whatever, know. And I think Lewis, you're kidding yourself again. Like, do the best within the limits of sort of nationhood to have fraternal sense of things, but you can't kid yourself about just sort of human nature, both its fallenness and its just natural limitations, its natural affinities and things like that. Right.
I don't remember where it was, but somewhere he has that. It really struck me the first time I read it. It was almost shocking. He talks about the English soldier and the German soldier killing each other. Yeah. And they awake in heaven, embracing each other. They're laughing it off.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Lewis has great stuff about patriotism. If your listeners want it, like the Four Loves, he is a fantastic book about sort of, again, the natural types of loves that human have for other, but then he also says the ways that Christians then, like, that there's a penultimate and there's an ultimate. Like there's ways that they can go wrong and there's ways that Christians should direct those to God. And he has a great section on patriotism in the sense of like, it's a natural, like if one doesn't have natural love for one's family, one's land, like you're not able to then universalize it. And that seems to be a lot of what modern politics is like, it's almost like hate your neighbor to love humanity. Right. Well, I mean, hate the concrete in order. Everything is about an abstraction. So much of what I read about politics is like so much abstraction. Like we're abstracting things, and I think Lewis is very much like trying to drive us back to the concrete of like concrete realities of human nature. And I think again for him that means both a recognition of things like hierarchy and a recognition. His hierarchy doesn't then lead to like the nanny state on that. Like he's very critical of trying to get into everybody's business. I mean, that is, there's multiple, there's a lot of this.
He warns about the omnipotent moral busybody being worse than the robber baron.
Yeah. A lot of this is about education too. Yeah, you're right. The Chronicles of Narnia have hilarious barbs throughout about education. What are they teaching the kids these days? Kind of the sense of using education then as a tool for this social engineering project of experimentation, rather than awakening sort of people to wonder, discovery, sort of transcendent realities to which you then submit yourself. The sense of submitting yourself to that which is higher.
Right. Yeah, this old school understanding of the liberal arts, the things appropriate to study for the free man who will rightly use his liberty to the right ends.
There's a good section in Voyage of the Dawn Treader about rule, and I'm blanking on the name of it, but the island that they go to, is it Ramondu's Island? I can't remember now. Coriarkin I think is the guy's name, who's a fallen star, and Aslan talks to this guy about sort of his rulership over these dufflepuds, and I think what's really interesting about that is there's a lot of discussion about what are they ready for,
right?
And I think it does actually relate to the father figure thing. A lot of people are nervous about the idea of government as father, rightly so, in the 20th century, but it is a part of like kind of just common human reflection of saying like the government has a kind of fatherly sense to it. Christians have certainly seen this as well. Like you mentioned the Isaiah passage about nursing fathers. But here's the thing about that. Let's just think about parenting as the model. Like, is a good father that which, just absolutely schedules out everything for their kids. Like there's no free time. Like you will do this here. It's like, no, that's actually really bad fatherhood because you don't actually teach the kids to think for themselves and that kind of thing. Right. But neither is a fatherhood that which is like, do whatever you want. Like I'm not actually not going to structure and discipline any part of life for you.
Right.
So I think there is something, I've thought about this because there's a lot of nervousness and I can understand why, but I think we can redeem the father image as it relates to civil government in terms of a good father, a good parent knows when it needs, like discipline has to come in. I mean, I think you see this again with this particular figure in Aslan of saying, they're not ready for the freedoms they have yet. And this is related to like Americans when we think we can sort of export freedom to the world. And I mean, this will shock some people, but it's like, well, maybe some cultures and things aren't ready for the kind of freedom. Like you actually have to, like the West,
and arguably we have lost the readiness for it.
That's right.
We are destroying ourselves because of that.
Yeah, that's right. We need some re-education about how to use the liberties that have been given to us. That's right. That's a good point. But I think there's a lot of like the category of wisdom and rulership of saying, okay, like I'm going to look really tyrannical here. Like the government's going to step in and do a lot of very powerful things. Well, that may be appropriate in certain circumstances, but I think this is where I would say, like as it relates to like libertarianism, of saying like there is an ideal of saying the ideal is such that the government has very little that it has to do. But I don't think you live and die by the ideal itself. You can't just press the ideal into everything. Right. You have to deal with realities. And so there may be times in which rulership needs to look quite, heavy-handed.
Right. There is a Bitcoin, especially in its early days, had a lot of libertarians and still does. Yeah. And there's a kind of strong history of that. If you dig down into the Bitcoin world, you'll find a lot of people who feel very strongly about politics and the state.
Yeah.
Where do you think libertarians are missing what God has to say about politics and the ruler? You did your PhD on political theology. You've thought about this quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of different directions I could go on this. We could pull it all the way back to the beginning of this talk about history and that I wish libertarians had a better, this is a very novel thing. Like no one was libertarian, and maybe and sometimes I think maybe libertarians almost put that as a chip on it. I was like, yeah, it's never been tried. Well, okay, but I think we should have a kind of sense of the greater, Christian thought, human thought of like. So that's one category. You could kind of just say like, have a caution about your own views when it seems so novel, so different than the ways that others have thought about it. The other I would say about libertarian is kind of what I just said of like, I'm actually fine when it's like put out as an ideal. Ideally, the government would have to have very little that it would have to do because there's a virtuous society that is able to police itself. I mean, not to like look back in idealistic ways in our country, but I do talk to some people about the ways in which like people policed each other. Like there was a sense of like social cohesion that we just don't have anymore. And so that's what I would say to libertarians is that it can function a little bit too much like an ideology and the idea of an ideology, again, is it becomes an abstraction away from concrete realities. Like it's fine to say like that should be something in which we should strive toward, like making a government being small is the best of all possible worlds. I agree with that. I really do. Like, and libertarians are often kind of a breath of fresh air. Like, I often say that. Like, it's fun to actually have a few libertarians in the government because it's like they're iconoclasts, and it's like, we need that.
Right.
But I'm also really nervous if libertarians were to take the helm of something where it's like, it just seems, again, everything becomes an abstraction ideal without dealing with concrete realities.
Right. Robert Nisbet in The Quest for Community in the 1950s, he warned about how kind of radical individualism is actually a great bedfellow with statism.
Yeah.
Because man is made for community.
Yeah.
And if you sever all connections to other people, what's left is a giant state to fill the void.
Yeah.
And that these things work together.
I think that's actually one of the easiest critiques of libertarianism as a Christian is, what's the bedrock institution of society? It's the family. I mean, that's just pretty much, when you look at the historical sort of tradition of Christian political thought, like everybody answers that question. The family is sort of this microcosm of society. And in general, when I've read libertarians, it's the unfettered individual. And it's like, I think, I can't remember who it was who just was able to critique kind of libertarianism just on the basis that it can't explain marriage. Like marriage is always kind of looked at in this like economic, contractual, like
right.
It's not able to really deal with the Christian biblical picture of marriage as a natural institution of humanity rather than something that's just kind of contractual.
Well, I think the even harder thing to explain in libertarianism is not marriage, because it's like, okay, well, you can explain that as two adults who make a contract with each other.
Yeah.
I think children is really the hard thing to explain.
That's a good one. Yep.
And what are the rights
of
children? Why and how can parents overrule those rights over the child's own
body? What
body?
does libertarian parenting look like? I don't know.
And I think some libertarians have they will say, this is a hard thing for us to explain, and they're wrestling with it. But what does Christian theology bring to the table with children in terms of the family as a small picture of society?
Yep. It brings, again, a picture of hierarchy. Not all hierarchies are bad. That can be a kind of, libertarianism probably better than I do. I'm sure you do. But, there can be kind of that trope of like all hierarchies are bad. And maybe that's Nisbet's point about like the bedfellows of community, like a kind of Marxism and libertarianism, like even though they seem like totally separate, this sense of like getting rid of all hierarchies. And I think there is just a Christian sense of, no, God gives authority to different people and groups, and that's not bad. Like when they use their authority wrongly, that's bad. Right. So that there is a check against hierarchy of saying you obey other humans up to a point, and that's in every. That's the marriage relationship. That's the family relationship. Right. That's church. No good Christian worth its salt, doing theologies has kind of authoritarianism, authority without any sense of like the needed disobedience that might have to happen in any kind of relationship. But I think a good biblical kind of theology of family and all these things is just recognizing that this is part of God's good plan. It's a creational plan. Like, authority is not the result of a fall. If you know the book, Victor Lee Austin had a book years ago called Up with Authority. I really liked the book. It was very impactful for me doing my doctoral work on political theology, where he's kind of taking on the 1960s, like down with authority, down with like, he's like, no, like authority is actually really needed for people to flourish. And he uses that, one of his images is of a conductor with an orchestra. Right. Kind of a low-level picture of authority, but his point is like you need one person to like give leadership to the whole, and it makes it much better than if there weren't. Right. And so I think he has some good examples in there. He has good examples of in the West in the 20th century, we can only picture things going wrong when the government's too big. But can you picture a problem if the government was too small? And he says, like, there's we have African countries that are, of course, dictatorships, but we have some African countries where there's just not enough authority given to the government to actually squash problems. Like, what if the government actually had more backing to it and could crush those, gangs and things that are wreaking havoc? Right. It's very difficult I think as you and I have talked, like statism is the trouble of the West of the 20th century and beyond.
Right.
So I think it's right. Libertarians are right to see that as like a major problem, and so we can join hands with them on that.
Right. In kind of American culture more widely, but evangelicals also absorbing a lot of this. There is a kind of simultaneous distrust of government, but also kind of an obsession with politics and with viewing it as like the be-all and end-all of how to change society and where the action's really happening. Where and how do you think are the biggest blind spots in American Christianity with politics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of naivete about politics among Christians, about what it can and can't do. Sometimes there's a naivete of like things it can do, but there's a lot of naivete of what it can't do too, like the limitations of government. Just like, is it like if we pull the right levers, get the right people, like is that going to sort of solve everything? No, like there's cultural problems. At the same time, like it is funny. I mean, I feel like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but you can see kind of either extreme where you do get other people who say things like, we can't do this politically. We have to just change hearts and minds. It's like, well, I mean,
we just have to preach the gospel.
Yeah. My great example of that is Obergefell and sort of like you look at the statistics about like American society's views of homosexuality and like what happens once we legalize it is like, that changed. Like there is what's sometimes called the honorific effect of the law. The law isn't the law is a tutor. I mean, this is Christian theology too. Like this is taking it straight from Paul. But I can't remember if this is the 1 Peter passage or the Romans 13. There's kind of the two passages, or 1 Peter 3 and Romans 13 are kind of the two major passages where we learn in the New Testament about what functions of government. But it's not only to punish the evil, but it's to honor the good. And so the law, it seems like primarily should punish evil. Like that does seem like I would agree with, say, the more libertarian side that says the primary function of the law is to punish.
Not to engineer society.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, what do you do when you say, if you do this, I'm going to punish you? Well, and then our Reformed tradition knows this with our larger catechism that takes each of the Ten Commandments and said, which are generally negative focus about don't do this. And so what the catechism doesn't turn out, well, what does that teach us about the positive function of this law? Right. Well, not only are we to steal, but we should find just ways to procure wealth and to encourage prosperity in just ways. Right. So the honorific effect of the law says it does teach. And I think it's one of those things, I think you can actually historically see this. Right. Where and this will scare some people, but like where a government takes a minority view, like it's not popularly favored, but institutes something, and then people pretty much go along with it. And it's like, that changed hearts and minds. Right. So this, I mean, one that evangelical Christians will certainly get, that has gained a lot of attention, of course, is abortion. And so you have some people that's like, everything's about the political sort of change of it. Like, we've just got to get like the political change about abortion. And then you get the other people on the other side saying like, no, we just need to change hearts and minds. Like, you can't instill a law that would, you've got to change the hearts and minds. You got to preach the gospel. Everybody's got to be a Christian first before you can do that. It's like both of those are really naive on either side. On the one side, if everything's politics, the example I think that's a good example from the Bible is King Josiah's reforms. So King Josiah, does all these incredible reforms in Israel, but it doesn't take, and it says the next generation just basically changed them all back. Right. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's that Josiah did really great things politically. He should have done them. We're not saying anything wrong, but it wasn't matched by a larger spiritual revival, whatever you want to call it, so that once he died, it's like everything went back. I mean, so Christians, it's like everything that we can do politically can be reversed like almost immediately. Right. So like we do need to change heart. Like there is a cultural battle. It's a culture war. It's not just a political war. On the other side, I think it's very naive when Christians say things like, well, we have to be a majority Christian nation again. No, we don't. Like, it's like, you don't have to do that in order to like stop murdering. Like there's a legitimate use of power. And that's another, like, I've talked about this before, but of kind of it seems like what has become more popular among evangelicals of kind of an Anabaptist form of like, all power is bad. Like what did Jesus do? He gave up power. Well, yeah, in one sense on the cross, that's true. But then he was resurrected and ascended as Lord of all creation. So can Christians have legitimate use of power? Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.
Related to the kind of, we would say, fairly naive view of politics, where and how does having a more tragic view of politics, or maybe a more realistic view? Like, I'm thinking right now of, all the hand-wringing that has gone on over the last couple of elections over evangelicals voting for Trump, and people truthfully pointing out this man is not an example of Christian morality. Yeah. How could Christians support someone like this? We should only be supporting people who are wonderful examples.
Yeah.
And obviously, some people, may idolize someone like Trump and, look past serious moral failures and character issues. But why and how have our ancestors had a more tragic view of politics and a more realistic view of what politics is and what it's for?
Yeah.
And what are we missing when we kind of just want to wait around for the perfect ruler to come along?
Yeah, it's come back to this, but it's thinking in abstractions. It's thinking in totalities that's there's not a sense of dealing with practical reality. Can we advance it from here to here? So, I mean, you have to think about this, the kinds of people in your life who think these ways, where it's if I can't do this grand, big thing, well, I'm going to do nothing at all.
Right.
Well, that's really silly. Can you advance it in small ways? Well, then that's good. Does Trump, despite all of his problems, advance things, or at least, even if you don't want to say advance, does it slow? Is it better? I mean, sometimes people use that funny analogy of, if one side is driving off the cliff at 80 miles an hour, can we at least slow it down to 50 miles an hour? It gives us a few more minutes, a little bit more time to perhaps correct the way. And I just think that is, like you said, a tragic way of looking at politics, but it is a helpful way of saying it stops voting from being a sacrament, where voting is kind of this be all end all. I can only vote for Jesus. That was a thing many years ago, right? It's no. I do think actually voting has a moral quality to it. I think Christians can actually sin in voting, but voting in general is a calculation that says will things be better in this way rather than this way,
right? And
that's fine. We see this even among the apostles, that there's strategy among Paul's missionary journey, about going to cities as often as we pointed out, strategy can take over one's moral principles, and so you have to be careful of that. You really do. You have to be careful about where everything is strategy, and it negates, like you said, the sort of just bedrock moral things. But thinking in just kind of, again, the concrete realities of does this advance the situation better?
Right. And coming from a theological tradition that really emphasizes Christian liberty and not binding people's consciences, it cuts the other way too, to where we can, especially as pastors trying to shepherd people through intense political environments, people's conscience may land them on different sides of political questions, and we do want to be careful about pushing really hard, beating people over the head. No, this is the only way to understand this.
Yeah.
And I did my PhD in Scotland, and that was really helpful for us because Scottish Christians, and I think a lot of Christians around the world, just kind of scratch their heads at American Christians and American politics, and the things that they feel very strongly about tend to be not always the same things that American evangelicals do. And even if I didn't agree with them about everything, or didn't share their every one of their concerns, it was different Christians can feel very differently, and politics can look very different among Christians in other countries. And so, you want to be careful. But, one of the big challenges of theology is always, weighing when and how do you speak authoritatively or more strongly.
Again, it's, I think, a lack of the category of wisdom. I don't think we think enough in categories of wisdom. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, wisdom isn't just sort of the black and white, the right or wrong. It's the, which is better. or which is less evil or something like that. But at the same time, like wisdom is still a moral category. Like to lack wisdom is a sin. Like the Bible talks about like
it's not a virtue to just kind of throw your hands up and say, well, I don't know.
But at the same time, wisdom itself is not itself always a discernment between right and wrong. It's a discernment between better and best, between levels of it's
bad and less bad.
Yeah, there's a grayness there, sure. But again, coming back to it of like one can say, so for example, you can say if other Christians take a different political view than you do, well, I think it's lacking wisdom. Like it may be willful sin in some cases, but I think it's just like it might be lacking wisdom, and you can live with that. Like I think that's ultimate and penultimate as well. Like some Christians do. Like I lack wisdom in certain areas that I need to gain from others, and so I can recognize that. While at the same time recognizing like you're still a Christian. So
I remember it might have been when I was reading a biography of Augustine, who was a bishop in the 5th century, and I didn't realize it until I read this biography, but a big part of a bishop's role in that day was kind of mediating civil disputes and lawsuits. And I remember reading, too, about how much Augustine really wrestled with the gravity of being a judge and of being a civil judge because he understood that chances are you would often be making the wrong call, but you had to make a call. And almost this sense of, Lord, I know there's in some sense I may and will have to kind of sin in a way because I just don't know. I don't know everything, but you trust the Lord.
That tradition of a Christian tragic moral choice, I don't know exactly what I think on it because sometimes I think it can go too far, but sort of like you can't not sin, like either way. I mean, what's the Latin phrase? Pecca fortiter is the sin boldly. It's kind of it comes from Luther's famous statement. It's in a lot of Lutheran theology. Bonhoeffer, if you know the story of Bonhoeffer, like people often relate to that. Like, he's under Hitler's rule. It's like I can't not do anything, but even if I do something, that's kind of sinning too because I'm not doing like what biblically mandates sort of government change and that kind of thing. But I think there is something, even if I get nervous about some of the specifics of that, I think the larger point of like we live in a fallen world, and so whatever situation, particularly for politics, it's just not ideal. Like you're not dealing with ideal things.
Right. You're not dealing with the abstractions that you can categorize.
Exactly.
Okay, last subject, and then we'll finish. You, besides interest in eschatology, interest in political theology, you also feel very strongly and passionately about the doctrine of the church and the importance and the centrality of the church. Why and how is diligent participation in the life of the local church political? What's political about the church? Yeah, it's political in a kind of... I'll just say this: like there's been a lot of recent like language about like political church and the church's polis, and some of that I've kind of come to think is, again, it's a bit of that naivete, a little bit of coming through. Like, well, we don't have to deal with our larger civil government. We can just the church are the nation, and it's like some of that is wrong, but there's also something right about it too, because the Bible uses, frankly, political terms to describe the church. I mean, ecclesia is just a Greek term that would have described the civil assembly of Greek, city states, and there's all kind. I mean, the First Peter talks about you're a holy nation. So there is a sense in which the church is a nation, like it's unto itself, but it's a different kind of nation. And what I would say though is what the church does and participation in the church is, again, it limits government from what it brings it down a notch. Is that it kind of relativizes it? It does. Yeah, that's right. The church, you have a kind of ultimate citizenship that doesn't negate, by the way, your penultimate citizenship. Again, I think that's so important, is that ultimate and penultimate is not about no importance. It's of the central importance of the life of a Christian in the body of Christ, which lasts forever. That then gives. Again, it brings down a notch of your then ethnic or national civil citizenship, but also gives meaning to it. It's not its primary goal is to get. That's the thing. It's not the primary goal isn't to give meaning to the penultimate, but it does give meaning to the penultimate, and should fuel us to be better citizens of these worldly nations.
But yeah, the ultimate sense of the Christian faith really is political at its heart, because Jesus is Lord is the central Christian confession. Like,
right.
We read this the other day. Like, there is another king, Jesus. It brings down earthly kingships. Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And I think there's a lot about Christian theology that can then relate then to the politics when we start saying things like, well, Jesus is a king, but he's a spiritual king. Like, he rules a different realm. I think that's really bad. Like, I think that can lead to a lot of either a kind of quietism in Christianity or a kind of like, well, then you give almost everything to Caesar.
Right. Right.
If Jesus rules the other realm, well, then like our earthly rulers will rule everything else.
Right. How are the sacraments political, and how do they help us to avoid this quietism or this spiritualism?
The sacraments remind us that, again, Jesus' kingship is also visible and this worldly. Its origins are not this worldly. That's what Jesus means when he says, my kingdom is not of this world. It doesn't mean that his kingdom doesn't have any kind of connection to this world, but then all of your life would have no connection to Jesus' kingship. But what Jesus' point is that my kingdom, its origin is not in this world. Its origin is from heaven to earth, as it is in heaven.
Well, it's kind of from heaven through the earth to heaven.
Yeah. So I think what the sacraments do is remind, again, over-spiritualizing perhaps evangelical Christians, that the ways in which Jesus rules are through, we might say, social-making convention. I mean, at the very least, there's a lot we can say about the sacraments, but I don't think it's wrong to say they are social-making rites, just like we do for other kinds of social-making rites in our societies. Like
you're thinking things like a wedding?
Yeah, weddings. I mean, just kind of like rituals of like festival tradition. We all have certain Christmas traditions that they kind of bind us together as a society. Like if society had zero like common rituals,
right?
Like there's just nothing that's holding you together. Again, it's abstraction. Christians are held together not just by our spiritual belief, but our common participation in things like the Lord's Supper and baptism. The Lord's Supper is spiritual because God does spiritual things through it, but it's also physical. Like there is both a horizontal and vertical. I think you can see this clearly about the sacraments. Is Paul is anxious to give vertical sense to the Corinthians that like this is not just a common meal. Like there's something like going on here that's beyond you're just snacking together, and you need to treat it as such. But at the same time, one of Paul's main concerns about the sacraments is that they form the whole as a whole community. So wait for one another. The sense of we participate in the one loaf because we're one body, and so we're formed actually.
And the ambiguity about discerning the body.
Yeah, right.
It's not either Jesus or the church. It's both. These kind of bleed into each other.
Absolutely. In
mysterious ways.
When you discern Christ as head of the body, then you also discern the body as your brother and sister at the table. So
right. Well, that's great, Robbie. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks for helping us think through politics and technology and the nanny state.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Good to be here.